Hello and welcome to Gaspar's History Podcast. This is Gaspar, and I'm happy you are listening. In our last mission, Bombs Away, we went with Steele and the Meat Hound crew on a trip to Wilhelmshaven in an attempt to sink the infamous pocket battleship Admiral von Scheer. They missed. They all missed. On their way out of town, the bomb groups were met by an innovative Luftwaffe pilot named Heinz Noker, who dropped a bomb on the 91st Bomb Group, 324 Squadron, and the explosion knocked the Liberty Bell out of the sky, while the men of the 423rd Bomb Squadron and the rest of the 306th Bomb Group wanted to know where that large explosion had come from. It was bigger than any flak explosion they had ever seen before. Today's mission will not be a first of first mission, but rather a historic chapter in these young men's lives as our journey continues to weave us through the daily life and death struggle that had become commonplace. We are at the end of March 1943. The weight of their duty is becoming unbearable, and many men are just barely hanging on by a thread. They continue to fly daylight missions into Germany with no fighter support. In fact, even the missions into France are hit and miss when it comes to Spitfire fighter protection. Some of the young men are getting close to 25 missions, but that is not an official number to end a tour, even though Dr. Schuller continues to push his case. What's worse is the recent death of Staff Sergeant Raymond Henn, which was a reminder that it doesn't matter how many missions you have, the chances of surviving are stacked against you. When I pulled the mission reports for this story, I was expecting it to be something other than what it turns out to be. I saw that the bombing formation had Lieutenant Lt Steele flying the Meat Hound, but that was not true, which is a reminder of what you may find when you are looking for something else. But as I dug, I was compelled to build a story, even though it was not what I was expecting. With that, we will get this mission off the ground, where we will end up with a replacement pilot on the Meat Hound as the 423rd Squadron makes a milk run into France. But first, let's open up with a letter Sergeant Bamforth sent home just after he had arrived with the Steele crew in Scotland. Dear family, I arrived safely in England and Scotland some time ago, but have not been allowed to write until now. I will take this opportunity to wish you all a Merry Christmas and to express the hope that we will all enjoy the next one together. Mother, take some money out of my bank account and get a present for everyone. Also, get one for Cordelia, even if this letter doesn't arrive until long after Christmas. England and Scotland are both very beautiful countries, and the people are very nice. I haven't been to London as yet, but hope to in the near future. The English homes look rather old for the most part, but they also look very comfortable and homey. I would like very much to visit one and see the inside. Mother, the best things to send me, if you can, would be chocolate bars, gum, and other candy. We'll close with love to everyone. Leon. Thank you, Sean, for sharing. This letter was written by Leon Bamforth and sent home to his family the second week of December 1942. I am sharing this letter because it is a glimpse into what our heroes in our story are thinking, writing, and living through on a daily basis. When I would go to Johnston, Iowa French class and do my annual presentation on D-Day in Normandy, I would always bring chocolate for the students and share with them how kids in France and other European countries had not ever had the luxury of a chocolate bar. Crazy, right? Leon is writing at a time when England and her people were hungry and food was scarce. Candy and chocolate were luxuries beyond luxury when people were just trying to have a meal. Isn't it hard to imagine what hard times really mean? Leon, in his own words, some 80 years later, reminds us, with his subtle request to his mother, of how important it was to get a share of one of life's luxuries during the middle of the worst conflict the world had ever seen. Sunday, March 28, 1943, would be the 8th Air Force's 47th mission. Steele was up at 3 a.m., well ahead of normal reveille at 06:15. He was not alone. The bomb group was flying today. Steele had a pit in his stomach, and something did not feel right. Was the pressure of combat starting to get to him? Was he on his last nerve? This would be his 10th mission, and his internal clock continued to remind him he was flying on borrowed time. Steele headed over to the mess hall for breakfast. The World War II U.S. Army Cookbook TM 10-405, dated 24th of April 1942, the Army's Guide to Cooking, with the supplement, of course, TM 10-406, Cooking Dehydrated Foods. It was the guide that was used to make breakfast, dried eggs, or their more common term, powdered eggs. Before we jump into a dried egg breakfast, let's give the U.S. Army Cookbook credit where credit is due, and I quote, "Coffee is the most important beverage served in the Army." Indeed, Americans and its armies became hooked on coffee in the U.S. Civil War, and look at what it has become today, 2024 today. But just as important in 1943, the year of our story. Now, let's hear a little propaganda. Dehydrated whole eggs have many advantages over fresh shell eggs. This is in fact true, and a nice way to market dehydrated whole eggs. The cook will take 5 pounds, 12 ounces of dehydrated whole eggs and add 14 pounds of water, or 6 pounds, 2 ounces of evaporated milk to the eggs, and then I quote, "Vigorous stirring is needed." Delicious indeed. No wonder the hunt for fresh eggs was so important, and no wonder a soldier would give up a month's pay for 2 fresh eggs. Steele finished the delicious breakfast, then headed to the general briefing room with nearly 200 other flyers and waited for the reveal. The anticipation of the reveal came with anxiety, and the reveal itself, well, the reaction clearly depended on the target, with St. Nazaire getting the largest booze. The big blue tarp covered the mission map, and there was plenty of chatter in the room about what everyone was thinking. There was no drum roll or fanfare, just a reveal. Rouen. The marshalling yards at Rouen were labeled as a milk run by the brass, Army leadership. If you've ever wondered what the brass means, it was a slang term for higher-ranking officers in the military due to the gold brass-colored insignias that they wore. In our story, that is the 8th Air Force's senior leaders. As for milk run, we have discussed that before, and it was a reference to a fast and, quote, easy mission. The mission to Rouen today would be a quick, short trip over to France, deliver your milk, and head back home with the benefit of Spitfire protection nearly the whole way. Whenever Lieutenant David Steele heard milk run, he cringed, and he wanted nothing to do with them. Steele was right. There was never a guarantee that a milk run mission was in fact going to be a milk run. No one could guarantee that any mission was going to be like that, and so labeling a mission a milk run was dangerous. Maybe because pilots and their crews were a little less diligent and not as prepared, thinking they could relax because the mission was going to be an easy one. The fact of life is, when you take your opponent lightly, you will get punched in the face. One thing is for sure, and that was crews generally loved hearing the word milk run, and it is milk runs where you will find non-regular crew members or flyers getting on a mission. The flyers were dismissed. They would attend their role meetings, where pilots were with pilots, navigators with navigators, and bombardiers with bombardiers, so they knew the specifics of their role on the mission. The crews would then pick up their emergency survival kits and their parachutes, which would come in handy when they were shot down, and then they would go through the labored process of putting on their cold weather gear, which was a necessity. They would then get in the Deuce and a Half or a Willis Jeep and head for their aircraft in preparation for the 10:15 takeoff. Somewhere between the reveal and the 10:15 takeoff, Steele had dropped out of the mission, and I do not know why. Here is what I do know. Steele is listed in the mission reports and on the illustration of flying formation, flying the Meat Hound in the number 3 position of the lead section of the low squadron. The mystery is further complicated by the fact that Lt Jones lists in his personal history as flying with Steele on this day to Rouen, with them flying the Meat Hound. However, when I double-check Steele's official records, he's not credited with flying today. Then, when I pull the aircraft load and combat summary sheets, he's not listed as flying, but rather Lieutenant Lewis Page Johnson, Jr. in the captain's chair. Lieutenant Johnson had been with the 423rd Squadron since July of 1942 and was a seasoned flyer who was starting to get close to his 25 mission hurdle that Dr. Schuller was so desperately trying to get approved. Lieutenant Johnson taking the captain's chair adds another twist to our story, an enigma of sorts. Steele was replaced late in the mission prep, and Johnson replaced him as the captain, not the co-pilot. Maybe he has official rank over Lieutenant Jones, or maybe Lieutenant Jones was in some sort of doghouse due to the collisions and crashes. Maybe the rule was a captain replacement for captain replacement. There is simply no documentation of it. What we do know is that Lieutenant Johnson would be the captain. Jones would have the co-pilot seat, and the Meat Hound was their aircraft. Interesting how Jones remembers Steele and flying the mission and not Lieutenant Johnson. This is another reminder of how time blurs memories and how if you want something documented for posterity, it is best to capture it sooner than later. The crew of the Meat Hound were at their aircraft. Lieutenant Johnson got a good look at the Meat Hound and saw the dynamic nose art that she possessed, the determined brow, sharp teeth, and focused eyes. In addition to Lieutenant Johnson, another first-timer on the Meat Hound is Lieutenant Robert B. Phillips, Jr., the 423rd's ground engineering officer, who will be the navigator for today's mission. Do you think he talked about getting to fly the Meat Hound to his grandkids? I have to imagine that he does. Lieutenants Johnson and Jones were a little surprised that Lieutenant Phillips was on the mission today. It was not unusual for the ground officers to get combat experience, but it was also not necessary. It is, however, further evidence that when ground officers either wanted or needed to fly a combat mission, their preferred mission was a milk run due to the perceived fast in-and-out strike. Lieutenant Johnson assembled the crew outside the Meat Hound and announced he would be captaining the aircraft today. The crew went through introductions. Lieutenant Jones was known to everyone, and even though Lieutenant Johnson and Jones had not flown together, they had been with the squadron since last year. Lieutenant Johnson was introduced to Sergeant Farrenhold, which will become important later in our series, as it is easy to believe that this meeting made Johnson familiar with Farrenhold. Lieutenant Phillips climbed into the nose of the Meat Hound with Staff Sergeant William Hull, the toggling bombardier. Lieutenant Phillips was comforted by the fact that Staff Sergeant Hull was an experienced and good gunner to boot. Moving into his position behind the pilots was Sergeant William Wilbur Farrenhold, who was manning the engineer's position and would control the defense of the Meat Hound with his top turret guns. Sergeant Farrenhold had just finished his first mission on the last trip to Wilhelmshaven, so he was still learning the ropes. Sergeant Steinmax was operating the wireless radio while Sergeant Piotrowski was in the ball turret gun position. The waist gunners were the experienced Sergeant Dunham and the second-timer Stokowski. Having Stokowski and Farrenhold join the Meat Hound was not uncommon, as our series has highlighted where newer crews were split up to fly with veteran crews as they learned their way through combat. Lastly, in bringing up the tail gun position is the reliable Sergeant Smoot. The Meat Hound was loaded and ready to go, but she would sit and wait for her turn to take off, which would be near the end of the line. The Meat Hound's engines roared as she bolted past 100 miles per hour and lifted into formation. Lieutenant Jones brought the landing gear up. They locked, and Lieutenant Johnson guided the Meat Hound. The Meat Hound was in the third position of the lead element of the 423rd Squadron, which was the low squadron, sitting in Purple Heart Corner. The Meat Hound was on the left wing behind Captains Robert W. Smith and Robert C. Williams, Bob, in 42-25-180, the DFC. Does Robert Williams sound familiar? He's the operations officer for the 306th and ran the crash inquiry on Jones and Steele just after their first crash of the Unbearable on January 24, 1943, 3 days before the first mission to Germany. Why is the operations officer flying today? Can you say milk run? I do not want to imply that Captain Smith is only flying today because it is a milk run, as he is a veteran of St. Nazaire, and he will later take a couple of trips to Berlin to deliver the milk. I am simply stating the fact that short milk run missions drew additional interest from non-regular flying crew members to get a mission under their belt. Lieutenants Hopkins and Pip were flying a no-named F-Beauty 42-54-22 and tucked into the number 2 position as Lieutenant Leland Flower called in to let the pilots know that they were off course and they were flying a different route than expected. Pilot to tail, how are we looking? Sergeant Babs replied with an all is well, and the rest of the squadron has formed up. Pilot to engineer, any signs of the Spitz? No, sir, replied Sergeant Rogers. Roger that, was the reply. As the Meat Hound settled into her third slot position, the crew started to complain. Captain, sir, the oxygen is not working well, Sergeant Smoot announced. Captain to engineer. Sergeant Farrenhold replied, yes, sir. See if you can fix the oxygen, Sergeant, and Farrenhold went to work. Captain, my heating suit is on, then off, Sergeant Piotrowski complained, and that was followed by the waist gunners having the same issue. It looks as if the Meat Hound was not serving up the most modest of comforts today. It would be bad enough to have an electric suit not functioning properly when the crew was flying in minus 40 degrees Celsius conditions, but to then be in a ball turret, tucked and cramped, that had to be the worst. Just imagine you are in a tight ball with not even enough room for a parachute, and your electric suit malfunctions, and the malfunction is that it shorts out or burns you, and you can't move fast enough, and you don't have enough room to get the burning wires off your body. I know you all can see that picture, can visualize it, and have also had short instances of burns in your life. Now, imagine that incident while tucked into a glass ball at 23,000 feet. The second element of the Grim Reapers was being led by the Oklahoman and recently promoted to captain, Captain Urey, who had Lieutenant Sugg in the co-pilot seat, and they were flying 42-5714 Old Faithful. They had an experienced crew, which included Lieutenant Patton, the 423rd's adjutant officer, who was manning the right waist gun position. Again, was this because of the milk run? No matter, all was good on this aircraft because Captain Urey had the ever-reliable Sergeant Roskovich on the radio and the radio gun. Lieutenant Warren George Jr. from Palestine, Texas, and Lieutenant Robert Oscar Malin were once again flying their no-name Deaf Beauty 42-5171. Their waist gunners are known to us and are experienced, Sergeant Bevan and Sergeant Florian Yost, who had come in with Steele. Also flying on the 171 were Lieutenant Simmons as navigator and Tech Sergeant Thornton on the radio, both also arriving with Steele on December 12, 1942. Lieutenant O'Hara in 42-5720, the slowly becoming infamous Scarlet, was tucked into the third position, along with Lieutenants Otis Tillery and Hugh Phelan, who you may recall flew with Lieutenants Jones and Steele only on Bearable on that fateful called-off mission to Ham, Germany on February 2nd, 1943. As they wade through additional information, it seems Captain Czech may not have been or have had the best personality, but he is held in high regard, so more on that later. Captain Czech in Skywolf 42-5218 is flying the slot with Lieutenant Cassidy in the co-pilot seat, the same view and position they had on the last mission to Wilhelmshaven. Things happen fast on a milk run. It's a short mission. Get in, get out. The mission report seems to suggest that the 305th Bomb Group had the lead, followed by the 303rd Bomb Group, the 306th, with the 91st Bomb Group, the tail of the dog. These four bomb groups made up 79 aircraft, were supposed to have another 24 B-24s, but they were recalled due to bad weather. The 306 commented it would be nice to not wait so long to call off a mission, but it was too late. They were engaged. They were over the English Channel, and things started to develop quickly. In other words, there was an escalation of conflict. Where are the Spits? Which was the enduring question from the pilots and crews. Spits refers to the Royal Air Force fighter protection and the iconic Spitfire aircraft that they were flying. Lieutenant Johnson from the Meat Hound's captain's chair asked for reports and wanted to know if anyone could see the Spits. Lieutenant Jones is thinking to himself, it would be nice to have some fighter cover. One of the reminders and learnings of history is where we get our information, or who documented it, and the only way to get that information is if they lived. In other words, it means we never get the perspective of who doesn't live because they're not around to talk about it. We then add in stories from single crews, or the ground crews, or even the leaders who set the mission in motion. We put all of this into a big bowl, stir it up, and it gives us a varying degree of certainty of what actually happened at a precise level. At 20,000 feet, pun intended, we know that 20 aircraft from the 306 Bomb Group and 3 squadrons, the 367th, 369th, and 423rd, went on a mission to France, March 28, 1943, and bombed the marshalling yards at Rouen. I remind you of this as we now get into varying degrees of detail and eyewitness accounts that start to conflict, but also reminds us that they were there, and this is what they saw, and this is what they remember. The Meat Hound was in the middle of the English Channel in good formation, but where were the Spits? Lieutenant Johnson and Jones turned on an east vector that would ultimately have them bombing Rouen on a 95-degree heading. The French coastline became clear. Sergeant Hull was on the nose gun, while Lieutenant Simmons had a nice view of the French coast and the dogfights that started to occur. Fighters from both sides appeared, and the skies were abuzz. Captain Rip Riordan, I still think there has to be a better nickname than Rip, had controls of the lead aircraft of the bomb group with Major Terry in the co-pilot's seat leading the mission today. The 423rd Squadron had the low position on the left side. They were in Purple Heart Corner as the group moved into France and prepared to bomb the marshalling yards. The weather was not cooperating, and the lead bombardier, Lieutenant Gerald Rotter, was having a hard time finding the target due to the clouds. Their course seemed to be a bit discombobulated, and the ease of a milk run was starting to dissipate. The Meat Hound's crew was chattering on the interphone. Have you ever wondered how the ball turret gunner or tail gunner must have felt when their interphones were no longer working? I imagine they probably felt like they were on an island. The Meat Hound was on high alert. Staff Sergeant Smoot, from his tail gun position, could see that the 91st Bomb Group was under attack. Staff Sergeant Smoot reported in what he was seeing, and he was aware the B-17 formations were under attack. As the 8th Air Force Bomb Groups feigned in the English Channel, the Luftwaffe found the close formation flying a little out of sorts and attacked the tail of the 91st Bomb Group. Not only had the feigning impacted the formations, it impacted the Spitfire fighter cover, who apparently struggled to find the bombers. Doesn't it seem a little odd that finding 79 B-17 bombers in the skies over the English Channel is all that difficult? I guess we have to remember there is a lot of sky and a lot of water, and it's not always easy finding needles in stacks of hay. When the 91st Bomb Group was attacked, an interesting event occurred. The 91st Bomb Group is flying 3 squadrons, the 323rd, 324th, and 401st. I am unsure which squadron is in the lead, and the diaries do not share who is the group commander. The Memphis Belle and Captain Morgan were flying, and as their squadron was attacked, the 42-29-537, being piloted by Lieutenant John Cohen, was singled out. The 42-29-537 had just arrived at the 91st Bomb Group base in Bassingbourn on March 7th, so she was new, truly a new no-named F-Beauty. A silver, gray, and blue Messerschmitt Me-109G Gustav, piloted by squadron leader Lieutenant George Peter Etter of 12th Staffel JG-2, focused on the no-named F-Beauty and shot 20mm cannon fire at her that ripped through the 42-29-537. The crew of the no-named F-Beauty could hear the cannon fire tearing steel, aluminum, and flesh, while smoke filled the fuselage. Sergeant Caruso from his tail gun position and Sergeant John Strozzi from the top turret gun counterattacked with a valiant riposte, and a band of demons jumped in, and it sounded something like this. That seemed appropriate as the remaining gunners joined in the defense, and the noise was deafening. The silver and gray Messerschmitt started to have pieces of her rip and fly off when Lieutenant Etter was wounded by the fragmented 50 caliber shrapnel that tore through his cockpit. Lieutenant Etter was shaken, but he had been wounded before, and he was able to stay focused with his sights on the B-17, all while Lieutenant Cohen tried to evade. Lieutenant Etter squeezed another volley of cannon fire that tore through the no-named F-Beauty, and just like that, her guns fell silent, and the Memphis Belle watched in horror as the unseasoned aircraft fell out of formation and headed for the water. The surrounding crews were yelling in their usual response, "Get out! Get out!" 4 chutes were seen leaving the aircraft, which meant the surrounding B-17s had hope, even if it were forlorn, since they were bailing out over water, and the English Channel had not warmed. I know, does the English Channel ever warm? The 91st Bomb Group would later find out that there were no survivors from Lieutenant Cohen's crew. The 42 29537 would end up on the shoals just off of the coast of Fécamp, France, a burning wreck, only to be witnessed by the Meat Hound with her large eyes and reported by her crew on their return trip from the milk run. What the hell is going on? I wonder how many times that was said in World War II. Sergeant Charles Counts, a tail-gunning veteran of our stories and a young man who has a lot of missions under his belt. The sergeant was getting animated, and he was certainly alarmed. He called into Captain Smith and Williams with a pitch in his voice. The 91st Bomb Group has come into the 423rd Bomb Squadron's airspace. The 91st Bomb Group had drifted over the 423rd in an attempt to evade the Luftwaffe fighter attacks. Like clockwork, the same call-outs came in from Sergeant Baker and Sergeant Wilkinson from Captain Urey's Old Faithful. Meanwhile, the Meat Hound was in her lead element third position as the 91st came over the squadron. I can only imagine the thoughts that Sergeant Smoot and Farrenhold had as they watched the lead 91st aircraft come within 20 feet of the Meat Hound. Would this be the downfall of the Meat Hound? Would Lieutenant Jones be involved in another collision? Sergeant Smoot was sweating. He'd been through a crash before, but this one he was witnessing. It was not that the aircraft were particularly close, because they fly closer than 20 feet. It was the fact that there was an unknown squadron coming into their squadron, the unfamiliarity of the other crews, and the fact that the interlopers were evading enemy attacks. It just made for an uncomfortable feeling. If the Luftwaffe makes an attack through this formation, who knows what's going to happen? Lieutenants Johnson and Jones held formation. They did not spook, they made no sudden moves, and that was the same for the Old Faithful, Lieutenants George and Malin and their no-name deputy, the Scarlet, the Skywolf, Hopkins and Pip and their no-name deputy, and the DFC. Captains Smith and Williams in DFC are pissed, and they make a formal statement after the mission that the leader of the 91st needs to be hamstrung. Lieutenant Johnson asked for updates from Farrenhold and Smoot and wanted a confirmation on airspeed from Jones. Tap the dial to make sure, Ralph. Everything checks, Captain Jones replied. The 91st slowly backed off, and the spacing became better, so it appears the threat had dissipated. But before you know it, the bomb groups were headed through the bomb run, which was just like having a domino falling, hitting the next domino, triggering the next set of events. The cloud cover was intense, and the crews were still under orders not to bomb indiscriminate targets in France. Germany, on the other hand, was a different story. Just over 2.5 hours after the 10:15 takeoff, the 306 made her bomb run at 12:50, when there was a small, very small break in the clouds, and the targets at Rouen could be seen. The best news of the day was that the flak concentrating on the 306th was particularly light and of no concern. It made for a smooth bomb run as the clouds opened up. Major Terry and Captain Riordan in Wahoo 2 led the bomb group through the bomb run, and Lieutenant Gerald Rotter released the 6 1,000-pound bombs, and the other crews followed. The number 2 in the lead group is aircraft 42-29658, which arrived on March 16, 1943, an no-named F-Beauty, which has part of the crew that brought the Meat Hound over to England. Second Lieutenant Jerry Cavito was navigating the no-named F-Beauty, and fellow navigator Second Lieutenant Roger Lindsay, who also came in on March 12, 1943, was toggling and released the death and destruction into the Rouen yards. There was no fighter protection for the 306. They had last seen the Spitz somewhere over the channel. We know there was some fighter protection today so maybe they were still engaged with the Luftwaffe at the coast, and if that's the case, then after an engagement with the Luftwaffe, they would need to head back home for refueling. No matter the cause, there was none over the target, but maybe there will be some protection when they get back over the channel. The Grim Reapers released their destructive bombs. Staff Sergeant Hull was fixed on the Wahoo 2, and he flipped the toggle switch when he saw the first bomb leave the Wahoo 2. Staff Sergeant Hull watched with a smirk, but of course you could not see it due to his oxygen mask, as the Meat Hound's 6 1,000-pound bombs pounded the center of the marshalling yards, and the shock waves could be seen blasting their way through the yards. Then, Staff Sergeant Hull watched as a big fireball lit up the yards. Nice! Staff Sergeant Hull was still focused on the yards when he saw the 91st Bomb Group's bombs start to land in the center of the target area. Then, Staff Sergeant Hull quickly found his way to the nose gun as Lieutenants Johnson and Jones banked with the rest of the bomb group, and they waited for their Luftwaffe escort home. It did not take long for the Luftwaffe to attack. The Luftwaffe had been dogging the 306 since the channel and had been on and off engagements this whole time, but nothing of significance had occurred other than the most unusual attack that did not exist at all. Gaspar, what does that mean? I mean, a Luftwaffe pilot made a faux attack. It happened when a Luftwaffe pilot came up on the 423rd Squadron, where the ball turret gunners had a good look at him, and he then leveled out under the squadron and emptied his guns and cannons into the space that was before him, into the wide open space. Then he dove down and headed for home. One would suppose that this was necessary because coming home with ammunition may be thought of as cowardly. Too bad all the attacks were not like that, but the next attacks would be much more real. What is it like to know that every mission was going to have extreme elements, a potential collision, flak, enemy fighters, and more flak? What was it like to know that your life expectancy was measured in weeks and not years? What is that like for a 19-year-old or a 21-year-old, and what impact does that have on you if you survive? As the B-17s rolled off their target and headed for home, the heavy bomb groups could see the damage they had inflicted. Tremendous fireballs and explosions erupted through the marshalling yards. I think someone hit an oil tank. Look at it burn. Burn, baby, burn. There was elation throughout the crews, but it was short-lived. The waist gun position on a B-17F is open to the elements. At 24,000 feet, the air temperature is close to minus 40 degrees Celsius. The waist gunners stood up during the flight and manned their 50 caliber machine guns through an opening in the B-17's fuselage, one on the left side of the aircraft and one on the right. At minus 40 degrees Celsius and 150 to 160 miles per hour, the waist gunners needed heated electric suits, thick gloves, goggles, and a hat to help cut down on the frostbite. Let's not forget the fatherly advice from Dr. Thurman Schiller. Frostbite is real, so pay attention to it. They also wore oxygen masks, a flak suit, and a flak helmet. In fact, one of the 306 ground crew members helped to design and build the flak helmet that the gunners could actually see through. And when I find that reference again, I will share it, but I'm pretty sure he was from Detroit. The waist gunners were also afforded a little protection with some steel plating welded in along the curve of the fuselage below the 50 caliber gun mount. The waist gunners had the highest casualty rate of all crew members, so we should recognize how precarious their position was. Sergeant McLennan was an experienced waist gunner flying on Lieutenant Fortin's 42-5394, a no-named F-Beauty. They were part of the 367th Squadron, the Clay Pigeons of the 306 Bomb Group, and today They were flying the number 3 in the lead element of the High Squadron, led by Captain Rader. The no-named F-Beauty had arrived at the squadron on March 2nd, 1943, at the same time as the Meat Hound. Sergeant Harry A. McClellan had a pit in his stomach, nerves, because now was the time one could expect an enemy fighter to jump out of the clouds and make an attack. Sitting like a sardine in a can is Staff Sergeant Earl Benson in the most iconic ball turret gun. Unlike the waist gunners, the ball turret gun position was actually one of the safest positions because the gunner was curled up in a small ball for most of the fighting. Staff Sergeant Benson was spinning his bubble looking for threats. The ball turret position was a key defensive position, especially when the enemy attacked from below. The interphone chatter on the no-named F-Beauty had everyone on high alert. Captain Rader was leading the 367th Squadron and was flying a no-named F-Beauty 42-5306. His aircraft was Captain Heavy, with Captain McKay in the co-pilot seat, Captain B.L. Phelps somewhere on the aircraft, as he is listed as a passenger. Man, there's a lot of extra people flying the milk run today. The engineer and top turret gunner is Tech Sergeant George Klusick, and Staff Sergeant Emil John Miller is on the right waist gun, and Tech Sergeant Harry M. Brown is in the radio room. The 306th Squadron had been attacked once. They crossed over into France, and the ongoing dogfight had continued. Every once in a while, Tech Sergeant Klusick could see some Spitfires from his top turret gun, and he was thinking to himself how he would like to see more of them right about now, but he did not. The air was filled with aircraft, both good and bad, big and small. Bandit, bandit, 4 o'clock low, came the call from Fortin's no-named F-Beauty's ball turret gunner, Staff Sergeant Benson. Frankly, the whole squadron could see the bandit, who made a very impressive barrel roll and commenced his attack. The 367th's unified defense erupted from the clay pigeon's guns. Would the hard luck squadron once again be victims of fate? The bandit, Fokker, ME-109F, was pressing home an attack, firing her 20mm nose cannon that sent the cannonade flashing through the 367th Squadron, and the phosphorus ignitions alerted all that they were under attack. The ever-exciting Wild Bill Casey, Andy Rooney's favorite, was flying his Banshee 2 and watches as a cannon shell explodes in the number 1 engine and it takes out 3 cylinders. Lieutenant O'Brien, in the co-pilot seat, is staring at the number 1 engine's performance, making sure the oil pressure was stable and that the engine was not going to overheat. So far, so good. Staff Sergeant McClellan from his waist gun joined in the fight. It's about this time that I wonder what the attacking bandit Luftwaffe pilot was thinking. It is documented by several bombers that the ME-109F yellow-nosed bastard gets caught up in the squadron's prop wash, and the aircraft stalls out, losing his lift and his airspeed, and the belly of his aircraft turns sideways, exposing his underside to Benson and McClellan, who do not miss with their shots, and the aircraft is seen to be decimated by the 50 caliber machine gun fire. When I read this in the mission reports and saw the documentation, it made me think of all those veteran stories out there where they say, "And that is when I thought I was dead, but then this happened." But what about all those soldiers who thought the same thing and never came home? I have to think that this Luftwaffe pilot knew as his plane stalled and he rolled to the side, exposing the large flat side of his aircraft, that he was killed, because killed he was. Now, back to the Grim Reapers in the 423rd Squadron. It was not long after the turn home that the Luftwaffe pilots found the 423rd Squadron. The Meat Hound's electrical suits and heating units were not working well, which was not the distraction that the gunners needed. A Focke-Wulf 190, with her distinguished cowling, came racing up from 5 o'clock low. It was interesting how the attack seemed to be low this day. Bogey, 5 o'clock, came screaming across the interphone. The attack was being made on the lead element of the 423rd Squadron, and the no-named F-Beauty flown by Hopkins and Pip sitting to the right of the Meat Hound. Sergeant Babs and the tail gun of the no-named F-Beauty opened fire, and Sergeant Piotrowski from the Meat Hound's ball turret was waiting for a little closer shot as he sighted the Focke-Wulf. The Focke-Wulf was a tremendous threat, with twin 20mm cannons that carried a marvelous punch. The Focke-Wulf 190 was at least 800 yards out when Sergeant Babs fired a 20-round burst that could be seen hitting the cowling. The enemy's aircraft made an immediate sharp bank and headed for the ground, under control, but also on fire. Sergeant Babs had driven her off, and even though he would not get credit for a kill, he certainly gets credit for a defense, and the squadron was thankful. Lieutenants Check and Cassidy from the 2nd Element slot position watched as a yellow-nosed Focke-Wulf 190 attacked the DFC, the no-named F-Beauty of Hopkins and Pip and the Meat Hound. The attack was from 3 o'clock and slightly low. The Focke-Wulf 190 had attracted the ball turret gunners of the 369th Squadron as it climbed for the 423rd. Sergeant Stokowski from his right waist could see the attack coming in, but he was blocked from providing support. Lieutenant Flower, from his nose gun position of the no-named F-Beauty, provided some support, but Staff Sergeant Wentworth from the DFC's right waist gun was doing most of the shooting. He started on the Focke-Wulf 190 at 800 yards and continued to fire bursts on her as it continued to press home and attack. Several shells crashed into the DFC, and Bombardier Lieutenant Chester May, who was on the DFC for Steele's first mission, felt the impact as the DFC's antenna was politely separated from her. Lieutenant May was on his gun as Captains Smith and Williams took the DFC into evasive action. Lieutenant Johnson followed the actions, and Jones was focused on the engines and airspeed as Johnson flew the tight formation through bobs and weaves. This whole action was faster than me explaining it. At 300 yards, Sergeant Wentworth had acquired his target, which meant he hit the Focke-Wulf and he had the right deflection angle. Sergeant Wentworth kept firing and poured the machine gun fire into the Focke-Wulf 190 when at point-blank range of 50 yards, the cockpit of the Focke-Wulf splintered and the aircraft flopped around, rolling over and passing through the lead element of the 423rd Squadron. The Meat Hound could do nothing. Lieutenants Johnson and Jones could do nothing as the flopping Focke-Wulf 190 rolled past them. If they were in a car, they would have slammed on the brakes to avoid the collision, but they were not. So it was fate that had the enemy aircraft roll over, just missing the Meat Hound's wings before its momentum was overtaken by gravity, and it nosed down, rolling over and heading for the earth. I wonder if Sergeant Farrenhold, Lieutenants Johnson and Jones ever told the story about the time they thought they were killed by a gunned-down, yellow-nosed bastard. But then this happened. Here they come again was the cry through the squadron. A 3-pack of silver and black Focke-Wulfs were at 11 o'clock very high. The Meat Hound had a very good look at them because their contrails had given them away. Sergeant Farrenhold called out the bogies, but he was the only one that had a good shot at them. Sergeant Durham from his left waist gun could see them, but the angle was tight for him. Here they come. The trio ramped up speed, then dove on the 423rd in an echelon formation. Sergeant Farrenhold was trying to acquire his target when he could see the tracers from Tech Sergeant Bezak in the DFC start flying through the sky. Farrenhold squeezed the lever of his twin Browning machine guns, and the music was to everyone's liking, the distinctive rat-a-tat-tat-tat. Tracers from Tech Sergeant Rogers over in Hopkins and Pitt joined in, and the Focke-Wulfs returned the favor with the distinctive, methodical cannons firing from both wings of all three aircraft. The left waist gunners joined in, then the nose gunners contributed. The cannon fire missed the Meat Hound, and that gave Sergeant Farrenhold a little more courage, knowing nothing was coming his way. Lieutenant Urey and the Old Faithful were not that lucky, and took a shell through the left wing right out Urey's window, but luckily it was a clean hole that missed all the vital parts. Sergeant Wilkinson from his top turret gun was desperate, and he was sweating in his electric suit, but he did not have time to think about the discomfort. In fact, it was not on his mind at all, as he was focused on trying to keep these yellow-nosed bastards from knocking them out of the sky. Lieutenants George and Malin were evading, while Tech Sergeant McGregor and Staff Sergeant Florian Yost ran through a machine gun belt while providing the defense, and the spent shell casings just piled up in the floor of the no-name Deaf Beauty. The silver and black Focke-Wulfs tightened their grip and re-engaged their cannons. A 20mm cannon shell crashed through the Skywolf and took out the command set radio, raising a few words of displeasure from Tech Sergeant Bean in his radio compartment. The Scarlet was in her number 3 position of the second element of the 423rd Squadron, which meant she was the furthest aircraft on the left side of the formation. The silver and black yellow-nosed bastards found their prey, the aircraft on the end, and the one they were hoping to cut from the pack. The nose of the Scarlet was shattered, and glass, aluminum, steel, and lead splintered through the nose with horrific noise. The Scarlet shook. O'Hara and Smith flinched. Tech Sergeant Sheffield was screaming at the incoming bandits, and his glove-covered hands were vibrating from the constant rat-a-tat-tat of his machine guns. Lieutenant Phelan from the nose was on the interphone calling for help. Lieutenant Otis Tillery was down, as in he had been hit by the explosions, and Lieutenant Phelan could not tell how badly. Lieutenant Phelan did know that Tillery had not been hit by the whole round, or he would have already been dead. Tillery was badly hurt and writhing in pain. Sergeant Phelan panicked from the chaos, and the shattered-nosed, gushing -40-degree air at 150 miles an hour was distracting. Tillery had been hit in the side and the chest with shrapnel from the 20mm explosions. So far, he was lucky to be alive. The cold air continued to rush through the nose of the Scarlet, and Lieutenant Phelan was doing his best to get Tillery the aid that he needed. Staff Sergeant William Mountain came into the nose to provide help. Staff Sergeant Mountain was an original member of the Scarlet crew. Phelan and Mountain were able to get Tillery's wound bandaged, and they held the compress against him to try to slow the bleeding. The 3 men were having the same old conversation. "You're all right, Bert. Hold on." Staff Sergeant Mountain reported into the pilots. "Bert's hit good, Captain, and we have him bandaged." "Roger that," was the reply. Should they throw Tillery out of the aircraft so the Germans can provide emergency care for him? They were on a milk run, so they were not going to do that. And even if they needed to, it was too late, because they were now over the English Channel. Staff Sergeant Sheffield would prepare the flare, and they would get priority landing. Back on the Meat Hound, they knew they were lucky, and the gunners called out that fighter support had arrived. Not only had fighter support arrived, but the Spitfires were now heavily engaged with both Me-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. I wish I knew which squadrons were engaged and who they were, but I do not. I just know that the Meat Hound was glad to see them. Frankly, the whole bomb group was glad to see them. On this day, the Luftwaffe was not done, and they would dog the 306th all the way to the coast of England. The Meat Hound's crew was on high alert as they barked at the Spits, "Get 'em, boys," but then they had to yell, bail out," as they watched a Spitfire go down right at the English coast. It was hard to watch aircraft go down, as it was a reminder of what they already knew. Their time was coming. The 423rd came into Thurley, and the Scarlet would get priority landing. Dr. Schiller was at a conference, but the 423rd Flight Surgeon, Dr. Samuel Simpson, would provide aid to Lieutenant Tillery. The medical staff got on the Scarlet and assessed Bert. The medical staff used the Neil Robertson stretcher to get Bert off the Scarlet. Ironically, the day before, Dr. Schiller was suggesting to the personal representatives of the Surgeon General of the Air Force that they needed the Neil Robertson stretchers. It just so happened that the 306th was lucky enough to, quote, secure one. Lieutenant Tillery was in good spirits, with the help of morphine, of course. Dr. Simpson did a fine job. The wound was cleaned and sewn up with some of the finest thread that had been made in Japan, which would ultimately be Lieutenant Tillery's biggest complaint. I guess feelings were still running a little high, and I suppose it was Japan that had brought them into this conflict. The Surgeon General's assistants showed up in Thurley and got a demonstration of the Neil Robertson stretcher and made the stretcher standard equipment for the Air Corps. Thank you, Dr. Schiller. I wonder how many times it made a difference. Just so you know, the Neil Robertson stretcher was invented around 1906 and is still used today and is considered the standard of care when it comes to getting people out of tight spots. Not a bad history at all. This concludes episode 13, Hanging On by a Thread. It was not my plan to go into a full story on this mission after I found out that Steele was not flying, but the Meat Hound was flying, and the story was compelling, considering that it was a milk run mission that had the Meat Hound nearly collide with two other aircraft, and the Meat Hound crew sharing the story about the time that they were almost killed, and then this happened. Our next mission will be the first week of April 1943, as the Meat Hound will make a visit to Paris to bomb the Renault factory. Yes, the French car maker Renault, and it seems there may be some vectors to this story. Until then, do not be afraid to find your connection to history, and just think of the things you may find when you are looking for something else. Gaspar, out.